Imagine coming back to your quiet lakeside escape only to find nothing but rubble where your family's cabin once stood. No fire, no storm, no accident, just a pile of splintered wood and shattered memories. And standing in the middle of it all, a smug HOA board member with a clipboard in hand, insisting you didn't pay your fees. They said it was their right, that you had no choice but to watch decades of your family's hard work be erased overnight. But what this HOA didn't know was that the homeowner's entire family had been trained to fight battles far bigger than petty neighborhood politics. What happens when a small-town HOA overplays its power against people who know the law and know how to enforce it?
For years, the cabin by the lake had been more than just a piece of property. To the Morgan family, it was a sanctuary, a place where childhood summers blended into teenage bonfire nights, and where even the stresses of adulthood seemed to melt away the moment the old wooden dock creaked underfoot. The cabin wasn't flashy, it wasn't even modern, but it had history, and every weatherboard carried memories too precious to measure in dollars.
The Morgans weren't permanent residents. They lived in the city most of the year, only coming out to the lake during holidays or long weekends. That rhythm had worked for decades. The neighborhood around the lake was tight-knit but evolving. New developments had sprung up, bigger houses, shinier boats, manicured lawns that seemed a little out of place beside the Morgans' rustic charm. And then there was the HOA. At first, it seemed harmless, a committee meant to keep up standards around the growing community. Neighbors liked the idea of shared rules, believing it would protect property values. But for families like the Morgans, who only wanted peace and quiet, the HOA's presence felt like an unnecessary shadow. Letters appeared in mailboxes, reminding residents of dues. Meetings were announced with an air of authority. Slowly, what was once just a casual association of neighbors became something more rigid, more controlling.
The Morgans never sought conflict. They paid what was asked, kept their property tidy, and avoided unnecessary drama. Still, there was an uneasiness that lingered whenever the HOA board was mentioned. The leadership seemed eager to test the limits of its power, eager to prove that no one, no matter how long they'd been around, was exempt from the rules. It started small. Reminders about trimming grass, a note about repainting the cabin shutters. Requests disguised as suggestions, but always carrying the weight of an order. Most residents shrugged and complied, but the Morgans weren't used to being dictated to, and they especially weren't used to threats disguised as neighborly advice.
That's when the first warning arrived. A letter claiming that the Morgans had missed their dues, accusing them of failing their obligation to the community. It was strange, since the family had always been prompt with payments. But this wasn't the kind of group that admitted mistakes easily. The notice came with penalties attached, numbers that climbed high with every passing week. The Morgans brushed it off at first, assuming it was a clerical error. But then came the second notice, and a third, each one more aggressive than the last, each one hinting that non-compliance would have consequences.
Neighbors whispered, some sympathetic, others nervous. After all, nobody wanted to be on the wrong side of the HOA board. In a place where appearances mattered, being branded as defiant could feel like a scarlet letter. Still, the Morgans carried on, confident the misunderstanding would be sorted out. They had receipts, proof, and patience. What they didn't realize was that the board wasn't looking for cooperation. They were looking for control. And they were about to make an example out of the Morgans in a way that would leave the entire community stunned. Because when an HOA decides that someone has broken their rules, no matter how absurd or unfair those rules may be, it doesn't stop with letters or fines. The power they believe they hold stretches far beyond paper.
and sometimes it can bring down far more than just reputations. And for the Morgans, that reality was about to hit home in the most devastating way imaginable.
The first swing of the excavator's arm tore into the roof like paper. The sound was deafening, echoing across the lake, drawing gasps and murmurs from those who dared to watch from behind curtains. The Morgans' cabin, the place where birthdays were celebrated, where summers were spent fishing off the dock, where generations had carved their names into the wooden beams, was reduced to rubble in a matter of hours. By the time the family arrived, the destruction was complete. All that remained was a pile of splintered wood and shattered glass, surrounded by yellow caution tape, and an HOA board member who looked almost proud as he explained, "You had plenty of warnings."
The grief was overwhelming, but grief quickly turned to something else: fury. The HOA had gone too far. This wasn't about dues or rules or paint colors. This was a blatant abuse of power, a violation so brazen it demanded a response. And what the board didn't know, what none of the smug officials with their clipboards and legal threats could possibly understand, was that the Morgans were not an ordinary family. They were professionals trained to handle conflict, to dissect lies, to enforce laws. Their backgrounds in federal service weren't something they advertised around the lake, but in that moment, it became their greatest weapon.
The turning point came at the first HOA meeting after the demolition. The board, confident and unrepentant, gathered in their usual spot, a rented conference room in the community clubhouse. Chairs filled with residents, some curious, others afraid to even look the Morgans in the eye. Whispers ran through the crowd, but the board members sat at their long table, gavel in hand, acting like monarchs holding court. And then the Morgans rose, calm, deliberate, and armed with a mountain of evidence. Proof of dues paid in full, inspection records, and the damning legal statutes that showed the HOA had no authority to demolish private property. Gasps filled the room as every lie unraveled. The board president's smugness drained, replaced with panic as neighbors began to whisper and glare in his direction. The lawsuits came fast. Injunctions froze the HOA's accounts. Contractors testified, and the media swarmed. What was once a private act of intimidation turned into a national scandal. Neighbors rallied, petitions circled, and the once feared HOA began to crumble under the weight of exposure. Slowly but surely, the Morgans' cabin began to rise again. Scaffolding framed new walls, beams stood tall where rubble had once been, and the family worked side by side to rebuild what had been stolen from them.
The Morgan family stood together at the water's edge, the sun setting over the lake. Their rebuilt cabin glowed warmly behind them, not just a home, but a symbol of resilience. David sat quietly on the porch, Sarah leaning into him, Emily and James side by side. The fight had scarred them, yes, but it had also united them, given them strength, and left behind a story that would echo through the community for years. The HOA had tried to erase them, but instead they had built something stronger. Proof that even the most powerful bullies can be brought down, and that home isn't defined by wood and nails, it's defined by the people willing to fight for it.